So, good afternoon. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Do you hear me? Yes, now I think the mic is working. I'm going to welcome all of you. If colleagues could settle down. Okay. All right, welcome to this conversation on public services and the future of public services. And I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues and comrades, and we'll introduce them as I invite them to speak. My name is Amitabh. I work with Oxfam International. This conversation has been, I would say, a running thread over the last 3 days. It is one of the most important conversations in this summit, and I'm really glad that we are towards the end of this conversation, trying to bring together the threads emerging from the last 3 days. But just to frame this conversation, let me start with a personal experience. I have been doing this job now for almost 2.5 years, and I've had the privilege of being accounted to 11 different countries, where I've spent a week looking at Oxfam's programmatic footprint, working with NGOs, communities, talking to them. And of the 11 countries, except one country, and that is Bolivia, and I can even give you a sense from Honduras, Mexico, to Burkina Faso, to Kenya, to South Sudan, to Jordan, to Nepal, Philippines. Across, when I speak to the communities, what I hear is that they do not have basic public services. What I thought was striking for me was that almost all of them said that a couple of decades ago, they had some semblance of public services. Not necessarily high quality, not necessarily universal, but there was something there. And at this moment, what they have is essentially private provisioning of the same services, and they do not have the money to access those resources like a private hospital or a private school. So that's pretty much the experience that I've had. And this is what we are also seeing if you look at the big picture. As a group here, I'm sure we all know that majority of the middle and lower income countries in debt are now actually putting more money from their budget for debt servicing compared to education and health. That's the reality that we are living in. So in that context, I just wanted this conversation to be done in two parts, if that's all right for my colleagues here. First, let's identify the problem. What's happening with public services? Why are we being forced to make these choices about, do we do care work or do we have our livelihood? Why do we have economic systems where you continue to see phenomenal growth in terms of wealth at the top 1%, but most of the people are suffering? So what is happening? And the second round, we'll try and move to the solution. So that's broadly the plan. And if that's okay, let's start now. I do not have everybody's bio, so I'm going to suggest that if you could just talk 20 seconds about your work, it would be great. So let me start with Isabel.
Thank you very much, Amitabh. My name is Isabel Ortiz, and I worked at Global Social Justice. I'm director there. And I've been director at ILO and UNICEF and worked many years at the UN. So I'm supposed to talk about social security and what it has happened in recent years and the problems we face today. Now, social security is a human right and is an essential part of the social contract in all countries. Countries have started developing welfare services for more than a century, and they have developed pensions, disability benefits, maternity benefits, schemes for children and families. And this has been a struggle, really, a struggle of social justice that has been ongoing for decades and decades. And it's a story of success. We have so many social security or social protection has developed so much. And the list of even things that they were thought that they are not affordable, like universal schemes, actually many developing countries do have universal schemes. And I have here a very long list, but I'm just going to read you a few countries. Argentina, Bolivia, Botswana, Brazil, Cabo Verde, Chile, China, Guyana, India, Lesotho, Maldives, Mauritius, Mongolia, Namibia, Nepal, South Africa, Swaziland, Zanzibar, Thailand, Timor-Leste, Trinidad, Tobago, Uruguay, and there are many more. There are many, many more. So the key thing is to realize that it's a story of success, and this has been because of the struggle started by our parents or grandparents. They were fighting to get these welfare states, and now is the time for us to fight for them and ensure they keep improving. And however, what our generation is finding is a very difficult environment in which short-term adjustment benefits, short-term austerity cuts are used to actually undermine all this progress that took decades and decades to build. So today, about more than 6 billion people are actually living under austerity cuts. If we had here a slide, you will see that the whole world really is advised by the international financial organizations, mostly Washington-based, the IMF, the World Bank, the development banks, but not only, also others, are advising countries to do these austerity cuts to the welfare systems. And which are they? They very often are advising to target social assistance and leave it just as a little safety net for the poor, but then cutting benefits to persons with disabilities, to children, family, women. These benefits should actually continue, and we should ensure that they're expanded. They're also doing social security reforms like pension reforms with a view to cost savings. So actually reducing the amount of pensions, and to the point that in many countries we have seen emerging old age poverty again. They're privatizing and commercializing public services. When we're going to see later in the solution session that actually all these austerity cuts, they are not needed because there are many options. Countries have so many options, and to have their budget, more robust and being able to finance their commitments towards human rights and social security. And let me just remind you one thing. All these adjustments that they are doing, they're actually squeezing the middle and working classes. All these cuts to public services, all this privatization of different public services, to all the reforms to social security, they're squeezing the income that families have in middle and working classes, and they are really funneling funds towards the wealthy. And tackling this inequality that we're creating today is part of the generational fight that we have, and we need to continue seriously if we want things to continue, to social progress to continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Isabel. I'm going to now request Jos to talk about education and privatization.
Well, thank you. My name is Jose, and I'm from Timor-Leste, the youngest country in Asia, and I also represent Asia South Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education, while I'm working as a National Education Coalition in Timor-Leste, which is a civil society network that works on education sector. We in this Southeast Asia region, we have least education financing spender, which only 2.9% of the expenses that to the education sector in Southeast Asia, while in South Asia is 3.2 compared with other regions. While the Asia-Pacific region has been the fastest growing economy globally, it is ironic that the region is the least spender in education in relation to GDP and total expenditure. This is specifically the case of South Asia and even Southeast Asia. Low education budget exacerbate inequality in education, widens gender disparities, and drives privatization and commercialization of education. The region hosts some of the most privatized education system in the world. Enrollment in private schools have been increasing in both primary and secondary level of schools. This has been the trend in Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia, and even the countries of Central Asia. Countries such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Philippines have high level of enrollment in private education institutions, still increasing until now. We note that with concerns of the continuing aggressive push towards privatization of education over the past several decades in Asia Pacific and other regions in the global south, where there are concentrate to push for mainstreaming public-private partnership in education, from the voucher system in Chile to extensive contracting system in Pakistan and Philippines. The corporate chains schools in Africa and South Asia contributing further to the privatization drive are various forms of innovative financing schemes, such as impact investing in outcome based on financing, which promotes commercialization and profit making in education. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose. And now I'm going to move to Angela, who'll speak on health and privatization. And grateful to both the first speakers. They have probably taken just 4 minutes. So that's my request to the other 3 speakers as well. Angela.
So obviously health is a right, and which we all recognize. Therefore, from that point of view, one speaks about the current status, and there's nothing, I know all rights are equal, but fundamentally the right to survive is in some ways critical for all the other rights to even exist in some ways. What's the status, and therefore what's the problem? 4.5 billion people are currently still not covered by essential health services. 2 billion people are still facing financial hardships. 1 billion is experiencing catastrophic out-of-pocket health spending. Therefore, overall, the status of healthcare is bad. Secondly, there are profound health inequalities. In fact, the people in the country with the lowest life expectancy will on average live 33 years shorter lives than those in the country with the highest life expectancy, 33 years. The children born in poor countries are 13 times more likely to die before the age of 5. Fundamentally, if these figures don't trigger a reaction on the need to prioritize the state to act on healthcare, I don't know what can. The Doha Declaration does talk about the need to prioritize health, but possibly takes a, or rather probably takes a wrong turn by saying public-private partnerships are the solution, or at least a significant part of the menu of options for the healthcare sector. Uh, the, there, there is no shortage of evidence of the negative impact of relying on private actors for health provision. Why? Because of the, by definition, if you are forcing people to purchase something as life-saving as healthcare, you are running the risk of shortening people's lives. There are fundamentally no shortage of evidence of the negative equity impacts of such decisions. Uh, and on the contrary, there is a fair amount of evidence of profit making by billionaires in the healthcare sector on the basis of of people's desire to live healthier and longer lives. For example, again, as of this month, there are 236 billionaires in the Forbes rich list, which highlight who make their living of healthcare. At least 5% of billionaire wealth and 8% of the total number of billionaires are in the healthcare sector. Big pharma is big business, fundamentally. Therefore, uh, uh, it's doubly unfortunate that IFIs like the World Bank have pushed for private investments in this sector, despite all evidence to the contrary. Again, I'm Indian. I've done research on healthcare within India. Our look at the 25 years of World Bank investments in healthcare in India showed that basically there is not a single evaluation in the public domain of its private healthcare investments in India. It shows that hardly any of the investments are in areas which have the highest healthcare needs. They are investing in some of the most elite private healthcare systems and are certainly not meeting the unmet healthcare needs in the country right now. So therefore, putting a human face to it, it's about newborns being detained, it's about bodies being detained, it's about any number of the most egregious human rights violations that have gone all the way up to the Indian Supreme Court. And despite that, those investments get supported. Similar trends from the US, where the Senate recently concluded that private equity investments degrade care and put patients at risk. Therefore, what is the problem? The problem is simultaneously lack of adequate attention on life-saving healthcare on the part of the state, and at the same time, the risk of privatization, which is unregulated and is taking place despite all evidence, peer-reviewed, researched, evidenced to the contrary.
Thank you. Thanks, Angela. Now I'm going to turn to Magdalena. She's going to speak about gender and inequalities.
Thank you very much. I would like to bring your attention to the disproportionate impact that austerity measures and the cut of public services have on women in particular. So we know that women are overrepresented in the public sector, so they lose more jobs as teachers, as healthcare. They also, because of their reproductive role and their role in societies, they are also more impacted when these services are cut. And this is very important because one of the major impact is that when public services are cut, unpaid care and domestic work of women increased. But the point here is that these cuts are possible because women are there to take the work that the state is not longer provided. So the cuts are really on the women's shoulders that are going to be the one undertaking the job. So if we look at the impact, we see very, very strong economic negative impact. There is an increase of poverty and unemployment by women. The gender gaps are deteriorated. There is a reduced access to finance. There is an increased risk of violence and exploitation, because when economic insecurity and poverty are together, increases women's risk to gender-based violence, but also to human trafficking. And of course, this is all related to a very serious impact in their dignity. But the point that I would like to stress here is that while all of these individual negative impact are very damaging for women, what we need to look at is really the cumulative impact and the overall context in which this is happening. So taking all of this impact together means that we're really having a very serious retrogression in gender equality around the world. And this is happening, so this negative impact or a cumulative impact on women that we're seeing due to austerity measures are happening at a moment in which we have a climate emergency, in which, again, women are disproportionately impacted, at the same time that they're leading the solutions for the climate impact. Also at a moment in which women are disproportionately impacted by armed conflict. So in 2023, there were over 170 armed conflicts recorded, and around 612 million women and girls were living within 50 kilometers of these zones. And we're also seeing a very worrisome backlash on gender equality, with anti-rights movements gaining momentum. They're very well funded, and this is also something that we need to take into account, because overall, when we look at all this negative impact of austerity measure and the context in which we're living in, we are really setting the scene for very serious gender gaps for now and the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Magdalena. Now I'm going to move to Sylvain, and we will hear from Sylvain on taxing human rights and expenditure.
Right, not on taxing human rights, but on tax and human rights. Thanks, thank you very much. We often hear, since I'm here, I've heard a lot, both a recognition of progress made, that over 1 billion people have come out of poverty since Copenhagen. I also hear, okay, but still too many. There are still too many people in poverty. And then I ask myself, what is too many? If we had 500 million people in poverty, would that be too many? Would it be enough? Would it be okay? Or 300 million? What's the benchmark? How many is too many? And what I would like to suggest is that too many is if there are more people in poverty that we could, if there's anyone that we can afford to help, then it's too many. And so the real question is, how many people could we afford to get out of poverty currently? And that question is also, it's not only the question I'm asking, it's also the question human rights law is asking. It's not very well known, but human rights obligation is to, for countries, they have a black law, international human rights obligation to do the maximum they can to get everyone's their rights and to get them out of poverty. not to do the minimum, not just to do the bare minimum, but to do the maximum. And we are very far from doing the maximum we can. And probably if we did the maximum, there should be 0% poverty. And the fact that we have 1 billion or 4 billion, depending how we count, is absolutely unacceptable at the moment. Since 1995, so since Copenhagen, the real term GDP has grown more than 3 times. We went from around 30 trillion global GDP to over 100 trillion nowadays. And yet, poverty has not decreased 3 times, much less than that. The progress we are making, said otherwise, is much slower than the amount of money we are producing. Take the example of Sri Lanka, a country we recently published a report on. And I forgot to say, I work for Human Rights Watch in the economic justice team. Sri Lanka in the 1970s used to be one of the best countries among middle-income countries for its education system, like worldwide recognized system. By now, by 2022, Sri Lanka went into complete bankruptcy. The country went bankrupt, had no money anymore. What happened in between? The taxation level went from an average of around 15-20%, which is around what's going on in the rest of the world, to 7% of GDP. Sri Lanka is one of the countries with lowest taxation levels in the world now. It is a political choice. Very often, we're not collecting the money that we could to deliver on rights and on public services, and the money is not going where it should go. Take another example in health, just looking at World Health Organization data. There's a worldwide accepted benchmark that countries should spend at least 5% of their budget for healthcare. In 2022, 141 countries spent less than 5% of their budget for healthcare. That means that 84% of people in the world, that is 6.6 billion people, live in a country where the government spend less than 5% of their income to healthcare. This is just not acceptable. This is way below human rights obligations and what people should expect to have. This is not, obviously, for many countries, especially in the global south, this is not their responsibility alone to spend that money. They often face very difficult constraints, including the legacy of a still very colonial tax system. That means that a lot of the money that governments should be receiving, in particular in the global south, is escaping them to tax haven and to governments in the global north. And that justice between countries in the world is one, I think, of the major barriers and elements that is stopping from having universal public services everywhere. And probably something that has been missing from many conversations here. There's many other issues and barriers to public services that are emerging that may be worth mentioning. For instance, the transformation of work and the emergence of the gig economy, gig work. You know, many of you may have come here using Uber. But the workers of companies like Uber, unfortunately, often are exploited. They don't receive a fair wage, and their employer, Uber, doesn't pay their contribution to the social security system, which in turn makes it very hard to pay for social security and healthcare and education. And then one last barrier I wanted to mention, obviously the cuts to development aid that we've been witnessing in the last couple of years in the US, but not only in the US, around the world, have also been massively affecting the capacity of countries to deliver on improved healthcare, education, and so on.
Thank you, Saran. Thank you for this round. So what are we hearing? What we're hearing is what is austerity doing to social security and public services. You know, I think that's really the story what we are hearing. And it is essentially a decline in the quality of these services. It is essentially a decline in the affordability. It is also in no way helping communities. In fact, we go one step further, and then we looked at the story of the gender dimension. What's the gender impact, particularly on women, looking at the care burden which gets increased, even something as violence against women. You talked about it. So that's really the story that we are hearing. What we are also hearing is that the money is there. So Sylvain, just to add another number from, when you talked of the GDP is now 3 times of what it was in 1995. If you look at the Stiglitz Commission report, he, in his report, clearly says that the top 1% have captured 40% of the new wealth since 2000, whereas the bottom 50% have just got 1%. It's very clear that this framework is not helping the poor, the excluded, people living on the margins. That's the story that we are hearing. So why is this happening is a question that we all must ask. But more importantly, what is the alternative? Where are the solutions? Do we have solutions? Because I really want to, challenge all of us. There is almost a notion created that there is no alternative. While all this is true, you will meet a lot of people who will say, yeah, all this is true. However, there is no alternative. I think we need to bust that myth. And that is what I hope we do in this round. Bust the myth, but it's not just busting the myth of that narrative. I'm very sure, knowing the caliber and the work of the people here, we'll also hear very tangible ways of rebuilding a just, human rights-based society. So over to you, Isabel. So let's focus on solutions. Yeah, okay, if that's... Okay, so you're right. So let's start with Jose.
Well, as I mentioned before, that the privatization of education system violating the right to education, because it's not free, it's discriminatory against the poor and the marginalized one. It is not inclusive. Privatization widens the gender disparity in education. Privatization leads to segregation in education and in the broader society. So we must promote quality public education as the only way to ensure the right to education for all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jose. Angela?
It's critical to remember to note that we are not in the business as usual moment. Along 3 dimensions. Firstly, we are speaking at a time when just last month a lot of countries in Asia, Africa, as well as Latin America were swept by a series of protests by young people demanding, among other things, yes, end to corruption, yes, end to inequality, but also demanding public services as the central. One of the slogans in the Morocco protests was, "We want hospitals and not stadiums." Therefore, across the world, it's no longer business as usual. People are not tolerating poor services. They actually want change, and change not in the eventuality of time, but now. Secondly, and speaking particularly from the point of view of health, we just 2 days back, the WHO highlighted that, raised the alarm of the fact that there are 30 to 40% cuts in the aid spending to healthcare since 2023, which basically means across the board there are, in fact, their estimate is 70% countries have seen a cut in essential health services this year. We are also at a time of declining multilateralism, but also a bit of element of hope of a new system emerging. Therefore, what is the solution? The solution needs to emerge and be responsive to this political context, and not just operate on the assumption that we're living in a business as usual world. It brings an element of urgency. What is the urgency? Is what is the action that's expected in this urgency? It is comprehensive primary health care, is the usual things. It's the action on health inequalities to ensure services are equitable, universal, gender transformative, anti-racist, and free at the point of use. The demand and the need is to stop healthcare systems from being commercialized and financialized, despite the temptation of countries to fall into the magical thinking of, hey, the private sector will come in and help us. It generally doesn't. It fundamental purpose of a for-profit sector is to make profit for itself and not serve the common good. The need is to ensure regulation, therefore, of private health providers, to ensure they don't discriminate, to ensure that they are for-profit paying discriminatory healthcare is never the only option available to patients. To ensure that all healthcare adheres to minimum standards, to ensure that the decision making around private healthcare is transparent and accountable. What is the solution? The solution is also to, given the focus on trade at this point in time, among the various things that are being changed in the global economic system that are changing is the trade system. Healthcare and pharma needs to be left out of bilateral, regional, and international trade and investment agreements. For this, you need citizen engagement, and above all, it's not about the problems of each individual sector. The days when health or education or social protection could wage its own battles and win in this current point of crisis and potential of transformation, we need to act, and act now, or it will be too late.
Thank you, Angela. Let me move to Magdalena.
Thank you. So my plea today has been in the challenges is that women have cumulative negative impact, not only because of privatization, financialization, and austerity measures, but all those measures are happening at a moment in which there is a climate emergency, there is an increase of conflict, still a very low level of participation in decision making, and a gender backlash. So the solutions need to be comprehensive. We cannot address the backlash on gender equality by taking only some sort of measure. They cannot be only economic, they need to be economic, social, and environmental measures that will ensure that we're going to put gender equality forward. So, of course, and this is going to sound as a shop list of things, but because of time, let me do it. We need to invest in public services, social protection, and infrastructure that gives women equal opportunities than men. We need to recognize, reduce, and redistribute care, and this, of course, it's very important. We need also to take measures to ensure that women are not going to be or increase investment, let me put it that way, in positive, increase investment in women at the community level, that those that are leading the fight against climate change. We also need to ensure that women are better represented in decision-making processes that impact their life. We need to have legal framework that protect women from gender violence. And we also need to have regulations to ensure that women are not left behind in the digital revolution that we are seeing. But the point that I would like to take maybe a little bit more time is the need also to invest in feminist organization and women's rights organization. And this is critical. And why it is critical? For several reasons. So let me very briefly to set the context. We know that now ODA has been cut, and this cut on ODA again are having a very negative impact on women. Only before these cuts that are coming in 2025, only 4% of bilateral aid was already for gender equality, and only 2% of the total philanthropic dollars. So we were already very behind. Just to give you an idea, AWID in a major report in 2013 pointed out that the average budget of women's rights organization was $20,000 annually. So this was the situation, and now of course the situation has deteriorated. And what is happening? What are the consequences? Women's rights organizations and feminist organizations first are the first organization that I said are fighting the climate emergency and are providing services to their communities and humanitarian relief. So if they don't have help, they cannot provide those services. And a second point that is very profound is that without feminist organization and women's rights organizations at the local level, we don't have progressive measures and policy at the local level. Research has constantly shown that many progressive policies at the domestic level, from taxation to public services and to political decisions, are taken because of the push and advocacy of women's rights organizations. But in a shrinking of the democratic space and a shrinking of the funding for this progressive organization, we're going to get to a point in which at the domestic level, these ideas are not going to be pushed forward. So overall, one of the other measures that need to be taken is to increase the budget to women's rights organization and budget for gender equality. That means establishing the gender equality bodies at the political level, at the government level. Those that are also being impacted by austerity measures, we need them back, because this is essential to keeping our societies strong and inclusive.
Thank you. Thank you, Magdalena. Let's move on to Sylvan. Yes, let's applaud.
Thanks. So building on this, you may not be surprised coming from Human Rights Watch, but I guess one suggestion I would have is that we should be, one of the solutions is to take human rights much more seriously and holistically. I was glad to see that in the political declaration, there is a recognition of health as human rights, social security as a human rights, education as a human rights. That's great, but governments are not following on that commitment. Recognizing health as a human right doesn't mean you just put it on a piece of paper and that's it. It means you actually allocate the resources that go with it. This is not, I'm not making it up. This is written black and law in human rights law. It's been in the law since 1966. And yet, governments are still, well, you know, healthcare for everyone is a good objective. Maybe we'll reach there. And we have a plan 2050, a vision 2060. But no, this is not how it works. You have an obligation to do the best you can now. And clearly, governments are not. So I would say first, move from that rhetoric to implementation. I'm not saying anything new, but I think it's very important to reiterate. And that includes, including for global North governments that are very good at lecturing other governments about human rights, to take human rights seriously for themselves too. And that includes their obligation of cooperation. And human rights obligation for global North governments is to make the system fairer for everyone. That means you need to review the colonial rules and laws that means that you extract money from the South to the North. That must stop. That's part of human rights obligation commitment. That means you must put in place a fair tax system. That means you need also to not stop on your development aid cooperation, because that's not just an act of charity, it's an obligation that you have to redress historical harm. So that would be one point. There's one process I want to highlight that can really concretely make a difference. It might be, sometimes I talk about it as, as maybe the one process that can take us to another era. This is the development of a new United Nations tax convention. I don't know if everyone is aware, but governments agreed last year to develop a new convention to agree on tax cooperation and tax rules that would replace this old system that we have that is broken, that is not working for most countries, and to replace it by a much more democratic and fair system. That was an initiative led by African states with support of most Global South states. And that is happening, it's making progress. After tonight, I'm flying to Nairobi, and next week in Nairobi, we're going to spend a week negotiating a tax convention, and that convention will be agreed upon in 2027. We will have a tax convention, and we will have a COP of fiscal issues. Same as we have a COP for environment, we'll have a fiscal COP. And that convention has the potential to raise trillions of dollars. You know, we've been lamenting, and rightly so, of the cuts to USAID, but USAID is $60 billion. A tax convention is trillions of dollars that governments can raise for themselves, and that will enable, finally, to deliver on education and healthcare. You know, we can fund universal access to healthcare. What it takes is $350 billion per year, according to WHO. Funding universal access to education is around the same amount. That can really, we could do that. What we need is to enable countries to raise, I'm not saying like excessive taxation, just a fair level of taxation, making sure there's no evasion anymore. And that can be achieved starting 2027 if we have a good tax convention. Every country, only 8 countries in the world have opposed a tax convention. One of them is the US. They're out of the picture now, out of the negotiation. The 196 countries that are left can actually agree on something and make a difference. So I would say that's maybe the one process we have before us where we can truly make a difference, change the system, and deliver on our commitments. And then I mentioned earlier the challenge with gig workers and the emergence of companies like DoorDash and Uber and others. And so another, I think, important aspect of progress we could make is to regulate labor conditions, because we will not manage to have good conditions. It's good to have good education and healthcare and so on, but we won't manage to fund them if we don't have good conditions of work and we don't have companies contributing to the system. And in this regard, there's another interesting process that is much less well known going on at the ILO right now. The ILO is currently negotiating a new international convention to regulate the conditions of gig workers. This convention will be approved in June next year. Again, it's coming soon. It's not something, you know, in 10 years, in 20 years. And ensuring that everyone, every worker, wherever they work, can have good conditions of work, and they can contribute to the system that in turn can fund healthcare and education and social security, is another very important step we can make, and again, something we can do very soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Sylvain. Isabel.
Thank you. It was great to hear my colleagues. And what I'm going to say, it confirms that what they have been saying. Now, the key issue is to understand that this is a world awash with money. It is lots of money in the world. It's a very, very wealthy world. And there is actually money for universal health, for universal education, for universal social protection. But what we need to know to do is to change the way that things are happening now. And this is very feasible. There are solutions available even in the poorest countries to start the way towards universality and towards achieving human rights. Now, how is this happening? So what happens now is that governments are told that they actually don't have the resources. There is no fiscal space, they are told, for human rights and universal health education and social security. They are told behind closed doors, normally by technocrats coming from Washington or from, the development banks, and the IMF, they're told that actually their budget is very small, and they have all these social needs will have to wait. Now the priority is to ensure that the budget is tight, and and all these austerity measures implemented. And actually, this is bad governance, really bad governance against all international conventions and recommendations. These decisions affect the lives of millions of people, and they need to be discussed openly in national dialogue. And the thing is that there are 9 options, 9, that all countries, even the poorest countries, have to raise funds and to ensure that, that human rights are implemented. And I'm going to go very quickly because my colleagues have mentioned many of them. But the first of these measures that are fully endorsed by the international financial organizations and by the UN are increasing progressive tax revenues. That means revenues not like VAT, which is very regressive and is normally the first one implemented in countries, but actually measures like wealth taxes, which are being currently discussed in Iceland and Spain, or for instance taxing the energy sector, like we have in a long list of countries like Algeria, Angola, Australia, Canada, Kazakhstan, Italy, Mauritania, Mozambique. And I'm saying all these number of countries so you realize these are not abstract solutions. These are happening today in many countries, and they can happen in your country too. You could tax digital services like Amazon, for instance, and this is happening in Belgium, Canada, France, India, Indonesia, Kenya, New Zealand, Turkey, and others. You could tax the mining, have tax and mining gases, mining and gas taxes, which are happening in a really large number of countries, which I'm not going to go in detail. But just to give you a very good example, Mongolia is financing a universal child benefit for all children of Mongolia with only a very small tax on copper exports. So, the chances are there to explore that avenue. Then second option will be to fight illicit financial flows. These are illegal, as the name says. And these are money laundering, bribery, tax evasion, trade mispricing, and many others that are happening. They're illegal and they must be fought. And these are large, by the way. Third will be to reduce or eliminate debt, which is a big issue for many developing countries at the moment. And we have very successful examples of more than 60 countries in recent years have renegotiated debt. There have been cases of debt repudiation, default, and others. And obviously what we need is a better debt resolution mechanism. Fourth, for social security or social protection, it will be actually very important to formalize workers in the informal economy and with good contracts. And that actually will raise the contributions, as well as ensure that employers actually paid adequate employers' contributions to social security. These are part of workers' compensations. And in recent years, because of these austerity reforms, very often actually employers have been waived from the need to pay the employers' contributions to social security because they thought it was a way to give some stimulus to enterprises. Fifth option will be to reallocate more expenditures from non-productive sectors, for instance, military or defense, towards, socially relevant sectors like health, education, and social protection. And this has happened before. We had very good examples. For instance, Costa Rica and Thailand, they used military and defense spending for health, to expand health. And however, we are seeing currently a trend towards the opposite, countries investing more in defense, but we have to question it as civil society. It is very important. What is the social benefits that we get from that? Sixth option will be to tap into fiscal and foreign exchange reserves. Seventh, a more accommodative macroeconomic framework, and we have very good examples of those. Eighth, lobbying for more aid and development aid and transfers. However, we know that aid is being curtailed, being cut in many countries. And ninth, and this is an international solution, it will be to have more SDRs allocations, more special drawing rights issued at the IMF, but without creating more debt and more conditions. And we had a first tranche thing. The key thing is to realize that there are many options available to countries, and a clever policy will be to use a bit of all these options. And so in that way, every year keep having a larger budget to implement human rights, like health, education, and social security. And as a good governance measure, do it through ensure that these priorities are discussed in national dialogue with, with civil society, with trade unions, with employers, with government, obviously, but above all, avoid the bad governance practice of take these decisions that affect millions of lives behind closed doors by a few technocrats in the Ministry of Finance, advised by the international financial organizations. This debate needs to be open because it impacts the lives of many. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabel. And we are almost out of time, but if everybody's all right, maybe we can take 2 comments. My suggestion would be let's make it comments, not really questions. So please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, panelists, for quite the interesting session and raising critical issues when it comes to public service delivery, especially when you look at the quality in the context of education, health, you can name it. But I think one of the things that probably we need to be spending time on is looking at what is the level of pilferage of these resources that come to the government systems. So the issue of dealing with corruption as a big element of making the services not good, because a lot of resources go unnoticed. The money that they are supposed to go to the social security and the like, our governments are failing to do that because of the high level of corruption. The second aspect that I would really want us to be discussing is the issue of debt management. It was good to note that we realized that a lot of developing countries are spending money on managing the debts. Some of the debts that they're managing is whose money had gone to corruption. So the money came, we are supposed to improve the systems, improve education, and then was used otherwise. And then we have got very big debts. At some point when I had the opportunity to lead the Council for Non-Governmental Organizations in Malawi, it was a shock when you look at some of the debt that we have, and probably as civil society, we have to get the interest into what is it that our governments are committing to the debt. Because once we understand that, probably we also need to start questioning that and then being able to deal with these debt issues and in that context. Then the other issue is currently, I think, COP30 is going to Brazil this time around. I think as we are reflecting on the quality of education, let us also reflect on how climate change is affecting the resources that are getting into that. And then lastly, I have what I call our government running what I imagine is politics of poverty, where we want to keep people where they are so that then we are able to manage them better. I think as civil society, we have to begin to start dealing with this politics of poverty so that our citizens should be empowered enough to challenge the elected in terms of, as they get into that, what is our expectation and how do we deal with that? Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Yeah, please go ahead.
This
It's working, yeah.
this is my only third walking to a room of a meeting, and the first intervention, ironically, because Sri Lanka was mentioned, and not that I'm compelled to say something. Number one is that it's not a political decision. As usual, Sri Lanka is a hostage of IMF. In any situation where a country goes bankrupt, agencies like IMF and so on would trap countries into a process which then goes into tax regimes, and then it escalates to positions where poverty, where you have never seen, emerges in corners that you have never seen. Sri Lanka has never seen this, where suffering is on a different dimension. I don't have time to talk, and I'm not going to defend Sri Lanka and its decisions, but third-party documentation is not the best that you can relate to when first-hand research is available, number one. Number two is that during the past 1 year on policy coherence for reforms that we have been looking at, mapping entire country, I don't know how many of you have sat in national budget planning in a country. I had to go through that for 2 years. And I will tell you, Sri Lanka constitutionally has 3 governance models: central, provincial, and local. And the provincial will get about 8 to 9% annually, and the local government, 341, will get about 1.5 maximum. It doesn't even go. When you sit at the table, Sri Lanka's main budget would still go to defense. Of course, healthcare is there, education gets little. Now, when you plan that, when your services is being delivered, I agree with you that there's a women who get massacred in the ultimate delivery. More than that, the children suffer like mad. Children have nowhere to run in this process. So the scenarios mapping that is not coming out in the world is based on data construed by certain agencies for various political reasons globally, for trade and other reasons. Sri Lanka is as much as a victim of that. Third point that I wanted to make, if you keep on trying to get back to redefining the limits of poverty, go back to what Muhammad Yunus said in 2007 or 9, accepting the Nobel Prize, that poverty should be in museums, not me. I'd rather quote Muhammad Yunus because he would know better than me on that. But the idea is that social protection to all of this, investing more and more, because I think what you said is that there's enough money in the world if you know what the national budgets are. We don't need to go to other countries to borrowing and getting into debt. There's a lot of money. Sri Lanka sits on amazing natural resources, and the nature-based solutions is now going to be one of the biggest game players that the UN is facilitating with all the multinationals. So number one is that there's money, there's wealth in the nations, there's people, but unfortunately our systems are being trapped by others, and conveniently our countries are trapped. And there's a lot of amnesia of convenience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we are out of time. I said we will take 2 comments.
He almost got the mic.
Okay, so now please go ahead. But let's keep it really brief because
okay, yeah. Thanks. My name's Robert Powell. I'm the IMF Special Representative to the UN. There's been a few mentions of the IMF. I thought it'd be just helpful in the spirit of not doing things behind closed doors and smoke-filled rooms and all the rest of it, just to quickly respond. I agree with an awful lot of what I've heard, especially on the human rights side. I think it's really important to understand that the work of the IMF is about trying to help countries put in place the stable financial situation and encourage the availability of resources to allow human rights objectives to be achieved. So I think that's a very important thing. What we're doing is very consistent with the kind of goals that human rights and social justice partners have, even if our mandate is narrow. The other, the one area I wanted to point on what the human rights friend was saying was, I think wealth taxes are important. Other taxes are important. International cooperation and what's going on can actually make a significant difference, but I don't think it's the biggest part. I think the biggest part of the tax resources is the domestic revenues rather than the international cooperation. The international cooperation is important. I'm certainly not But you know, moving quickly on domestic resources is something that individual countries can do quickly now, and that's by far the biggest chunk of financing the SDGs and what have you. If you've got 4 trillion, maybe 3 trillion is going to come from domestic revenue mobilization. The other thing, just for my friend from Sri Lanka, I mean, just to be clear on this kind of IMF program debate, countries come to the IMF when they've got a whole bunch of bad options, frankly. You know, it's not that the IMF imposes the bad options. The bad options are there, and then the IMF tries to help countries work through what those options are and come up with the best of the bad options and try to help the country get more resources to try and implement those best of the bad options, if you like. So I think it's important to remember the issue of ownership. The IMF should never be telling countries what they must do. It's really important for countries and the leaders of countries to take ownership for their programs, come to the IMF for best advice, neutral advice if they can, but it shouldn't be that the IMF is ever imposing something on a country. Countries are always in a position to walk away. I've spoken too long, but I apologize, but it just seemed relevant to come in the spirit of open dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really helpful, as in it would have been good to have more time and engage with this conversation, because IMF is very often seen as a critical actor. And in this conversation, particularly what you heard, I think people would want to really engage with what you're saying. But we're out of time, and let's hope we can we can take back 2 or 3 things. These are my take-homes. I'm sure all of us have got different pieces from it. One, I think there's, at least here, there's clear consensus that there's enough wealth in this country, to in the world, to ensure that we can build a more just society. I think that's clear. Nobody's saying that resources are inadequate. What we are saying is that the resources have not been distributed or deployed the way they need to be deployed. So that's one very clear message that I get. But the second, I think what Angela said, this was clearly Isabel's message, but what Angela said is something I want all of us to really keep in mind. And I'm coming from the Asia Pacific Social Forum. And in that forum, I kept hearing social movements, citizens group, youth groups remind everybody about the narrative of anger that we are seeing across the world. There is a narrative of anger which is taking action in the form of spontaneous citizens movement, and you've seen it from Madagascar to Nepal, and it's happening in different parts. We need to really engage with that anger if we want to transform where we are. That's an expression of the inequality we see. That's an expression of how we are seeing deprivation of public services, and therefore there's need for immediate intervention. And finally, Sylvain, I can see that you need to run. So let me just end with what you're saying, because that's a framework that we all understand. That these public services are not, let's not call them public services. They're rights. And the Doha Declaration is also talking about it. And then let's work with that framing of seeing education, health as a right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. A huge thanks to the panelists. A round of applause for them.
Thank you. We'll join you soon.
You want us to sitting or standing?